July 25th, 2019, we continue Steve Delia's series of interviews with poets. Today, Steve interviews accomplished dancer, singer, and professor of Russian language and literature at Swarthmore College, Sibelan Forrester.
Hi, Sibelan.
Hey, Steve.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've really been enjoying watching the series on YouTube.
Well, out of all the poets that we've interviewed so far, you're probably the poet I know the least and know your work the least, because I've known all these other poets for years and years and years. So first of all, how did you get involved with poetry? When did you first start writing, become interested?
I started writing as a kid, and my first few poems are lost in the depths of time, and they rhymed, and I don't even remember. I have a couple memorized from early on. I'll read them to you. There was one I wrote with my best friend when I was 15, and it's called Sigh. Two snails smirking smugly slid through slippery sedge. Two sledgehammers smartly smashed the snails, who smirked no longer smugly, being but smudges upon the sand. For 15.
Wonderful.
But the one I wrote when I was 16, all by myself, is better. And I've read this at readings. You may have heard me.
You started improving right away.
Yes. So this I don't remember the title. The title was some silly thing, but it goes, "My true love is a garbage man, most highly placed. He turned to refuse when he found too many morons college bound. Now, while driving his garbage van, he has a taste of a life that is safe and sound, both feet literally on the ground. True peace lies in a garbage can. Oh, what a waste." And then there's a kind of a blank space where I don't remember anything I wrote. But I was writing in college, and at first I was writing quite a bit. I won one of those Academy of American Poets poetry prizes that they give to people in college. It was $100. And $100 got you something. Then I got a really nice pair of earrings, which I think is what we should do with our poetry.
$100 for poetry is nice.
It's damn good,
Yeah.
Even still.
Even still.
And then I was in a class where we were reading the Russian modernists, Akhmatova, Mandelstam, Tsvetaeva, and I thought, I couldn't do this. If there were a revolution, I'd be, sweeping the floor and diapering the baby. I would not be writing poetry and have my child die in a children's home or something. That made me a little less eager to be a poet with the big P. And when I was graduating from college, there was a moment where I thought, if I don't get into graduate school, I'll go live in Santa Fe and wash dishes. But I got into graduate school, so then I thought, well, when I'm a professor, if that works out, then I'll be able to support my poetry habit by being a professor. It turns out being a professor is really 60, 70-hour-a-week job. So there are times when I don't write anything for a while. Then, on the other hand, I sometimes get to translate poetry as part of my scholarly work, so I guess it balances.
What was your major in your schooling?
I was a Russian major at Bryn Mawr College, and then went to graduate school at Indiana University. Then I had a teaching job at Oberlin College. I had the good luck to come on the market, as they say, in the years of glasnost and perestroika, where Gorbachev was a big deal, and many places that weren't teaching Russian decided they would add Russian. Places that had been teaching Russian had sometimes over-tenured people in the 60s or 70s, and those people were starting to retire. So I got, I think, 4 job offers my first time out. 5 years into the time at Oberlin, the position at Swarthmore College opened, and I thought, that sounds really good. They wanted someone who worked on poetry, Russian poetry, and who worked on women writers. And I thought, this is just what I do. And I photocopied the announcement and blew it up so it was almost a page in size, and put it in my desk drawer, and I would pull it out and look at it, and I thought, okay, this is a sign, I better apply for that. Of course, now that I'm at Swarthmore College, I never get to teach a course on Russian women poets. There just isn't one. But they were trying to balance who they had, so it's worked out very well for me. I'm quite happy there, in spite of not writing as much poetry as I might have if I'd been washing dishes in Santa Fe.
Who were you reading in those days?
Just anybody I got my hands on. But reading Russian poets a lot, because that wound up being what I specialized in. So I wrote my dissertation on Marina Tsvetaeva, who was a really, really super marvelous modernist poet, whose biography is almost too interesting to take a look at her poetry. she emigrated and then she went back, and I still liked her after finishing my dissertation. Any of you who's done a dissertation know that's saying something.
Would you say that was very influential on your own poetry, or were you coming from some other direction?
That's a really good question, and I tried a couple times to write a Russian poem in the early 20th century style, which rhymes and scans, and maybe it has a little bit of metrical freedom, but it's much more traditional than poetry in other countries. So my stuff mostly doesn't rhyme and scan, in spite of the garbage man who did rhyme and scan. See, I didn't use that rhyme. I should have had it on my list. But my stuff is pretty much free verse, although I like to put sound patterning in. I think thematically, yes, it has influenced me, just not stylistically. Oh yes, when I tried to write a Russian poem, it was just awful. It was like carved out of bubblegum or something. I thought, oh, this is not working for me.
The Russian poetry that you were reading, was a lot of that free verse, or did they tend to use different forms?
In the 1910s, they were moving towards free verse, and most of the poets did something in free verse, but then in the Soviet period, the Soviet literary establishment kind of forced people to become more classical and to pull back from freer verse forms. And Russian poets who had emigrated, I think, felt that it was their duty to maintain the grand classics, like Pushkin and so on. And so often they became more traditional in their verse forms, although Tsvetaeva didn't. Tsvetaeva is really quite experimental and wonderful, and is in that way kind of like the Russian formalists like Mayakovsky. Poetry kind of went into a deep freeze in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, and it all came out in these late 1980s, right, the Glasnost years, when all of a sudden you got things published that had been forbidden since the 1920s, and it all felt very fresh, even though, you know, Gumilyov was shot in 1921, Mandelstam died on his way to a camp in 1938, Tsvetaeva killed herself in 1941 after the war started. All of this suddenly was available, and people were just really fascinated. But in the meantime, you'd had all kinds of underground writing that was in free verse, and a lot of that was quite experimental and definitely up to the level of what poetry was doing outside of the Soviet Union.
Was a lot of the underground poetry, was that sort of, were they doing political things that couldn't sort of come into the mainstream?
Yeah, sometimes I would say that the main dissident emphasis was more on history, the idea of writing about the Gulag and what had happened there, and stories of oppression, stories of people being arrested, stories of corruption, right? Where with poetry and with fiction both, it was more just freedom not to talk about politics. So not writing a political poem becomes something dissident because it's not about politics. So that's actually not what I work on. I really work on the early 20th century, although I've been translating living Russian poets, which is a lot of fun.
Speaking of political poetry, do you yourself go down that road, or do you?
You know, I don't, and I have a poem about that maybe I have in my folder I'll look at when we take a break, saying, you know, to myself, you should be writing an important political poem, and then saying, I don't feel like writing a political poem, what are you talking about? and back and forth, that it just, so far I haven't. I've written occasionally about horrible events in current events or horrible events in world history, but as far as politics, the moment I try to write about it, it just, again, turns into some kind of petrified thing. Some people are great at that, and I don't know that I wish that I was, but I'm certainly not.
Do you have specific subject matter that you tend to write about, or is there certain subjects that you don't want to go near, too?
Oh, that's a good question. I've written a lot of love poetry over the years, and I remember as a young person, I would sometimes meet older poets and think, oh, come on, why are you flirting with me? I'm not interested. You're like 90 years old, come on. But then, looking back, I realized that sex is really important in poetry, and feeling desire is really important, and sort of cracking open because you want somebody else can lead to all kinds of interesting things with language and interesting ways of understanding what's going on. And I think being brutally honest about your own motivations sometimes. So I have a lot of that kind of thing. And then I also just find if I get any kind of poetic idea, I try to make myself write about it, unless I'm running off to something or I'm in the middle of washing the dishes. not diapering babies anymore, thank goodness, but that would have been another kind of, I can't put this down and grab my, sorry, just don't, don't stick yourself on the diaper pin while I quickly finish this sonnet. But if I get an idea of any kind, I try to write it up. So if I'm walking to work now, I got this great little free field notes notebook. And it's, so if I get an idea for a poem, I just stop and write it down, or more often I don't stop, and so it's horribly illegible as I'm walking to work, which takes 20 or 25 minutes, and that's a good amount of time. Any kind of idea. And then often it's just nothing in particular. It's, I don't know, talking about the elderflowers outside or something. But if I feel like I've got a little jolt of an idea, I think of it as playing scales. If you play scales long enough, then maybe you'll get a melody. If you write down things you think about, then maybe one of the things you think about will flower into a genuine poem. I have a recent one about cicadas that I like. I'll read it to you in a little bit. It's still in my journal, which is where things get written.
Yeah, does your poems always start in your journal?
Not always, but I try to record them there. So the ones in the little notebook I put into there just so they're all in the same place if I want to go back sometime. Maybe someday, long after I'm gone, some poor MA student will have to read all of my journals for their thesis. Like, crap, her handwriting just gets worse and worse. So it's all in there somewhere. I mean, actually, you know, some people are embarrassed to keep a journal and they worry about privacy, but I've got so many volumes now because I started when I was 18, and that's quite a long time ago. Just volume after volume. Nobody, even my own children, are going to read this stuff when I'm gone.
The privacy thing is interesting because even poets that don't think they're writing about themselves still are. That you always come out in your, do you
oh, absolutely.
think that's true?
Absolutely. I mean, even Wallace Stevens, right? Who seems to be the most abstracted. You know, there are definitely things you can see happening connected to his own life. I think that since Freud, people are much more careful writing about themselves, or else they're kind of out there and, you know, screw it, I'm just going to say everything there is to say about me and talk about every misery I've ever had. You know, it'll make a sizzling poem now, this offense from 3rd grade. I started writing poems about classical topics. So one that's called The Amazon and the Anthropologist, that imagines the anthropologist has just been interviewing the Amazon, and the Amazon's explaining this is how we actually live. And if, you know, it ends by saying, if you want to try shooting my bow, you're going to have to get this breast cut off because otherwise you can't stand properly. So
that's sacrificing for art.
Yeah, indeed, or at least for aim. So I don't know that is about me, but it definitely shows I'm interested in women's lives, I'm interested in history, I'm interested in the contact of a scholarly approach with lived experience. One of the books I had read about Amazons says that the Amazons are fascinating in Greek discourse because they offer a different way of being, that in Greek discourse the proper woman is the wife who sits home, and then you have maidservants and slaves, and then you have hetairai who are sort of courtesans, and the Amazon is just outside of all of that, doing things that women aren't supposed to do. So of course a figure like that is interesting to a woman poet, you know, many centuries down. Also, I find if I write a poem that has reference to other cultural systems, whether it be Russian poets or classical antiquity or mythology or a more recent poet, it's like a citation in a paper. It does the work that you don't have to do. You don't have to write these 5 pages because you've referred to this other thing, but it opens a door into a room out of the poem that then is present even though it's just the opening. You don't go into the room in the poem, but you say, here's this Amazon thing.